Breslau. The summer of 1912, a great German chess congress, the finest masters of the age gathered over the boards. On one side, Stepan Levitsky of Russia, with the white pieces. On the other, Frank Marshall, the leading American master, a man who hunted beauty in the wildest positions. If a quiet game like this is how you'd like to fall asleep, take a moment to subscribe. There's a new one each week. That old city is known today as Wrocław in western Poland, but in 1912 it was Breslau, and the eyes of the chess world were on it. Marshall had a gift for the bold and the surprising. Where others saw danger, he saw a chance for something unforgettable. He had been the United States champion for years and would hold that title for nearly 3 decades, the longest reign the country has ever known. He founded the chess club in New York that still bears his name, where players gather over the boards to this day. And he was famous for the swindle, for conjuring tricks and traps out of positions that looked already lost. And in this game he found it, a single quiet move so astonishing it has been told and retold for more than a century. Across the board sat Stepan Levitsky, a respected Russian master, sound and steady, on most days a hard man to beat. This was the great congress of the German Chess Federation, in the last summer of peace before the world tipped into war. The masters of Europe had gathered in Breslau, and it was still an age that prized a daring attack far above a safe little point. He would place his queen, the most precious piece he owned, on a square where 3 enemy men could reach out and take it. And yet not one of them could. Every capture led only to ruin. The story goes that the delighted onlookers showered the board with gold coins, so it has been called, ever since, the gold coins game. Levitsky resigned at once. Marshall had his masterpiece, and black had won. In the years since, the game has been printed in countless books, and the move at its heart is shown to children just learning to play. Levitsky would be remembered, more than anything, for sitting on the wrong side of it. Now close your eyes and let the board take shape in the dark before you. White has the first word. The queen's pawn steps forward to d4, and the center is claimed without a struggle. Black answers softly, a pawn to e6. Just a small door open for a bishop, nothing more for now. White plants a second pawn beside the first, to e4. 2 pawns abreast across the middle of the board, broad and confident. And black strikes at it, a pawn to d5. It leans against the e4 pawn and quietly asks it a question. White answers by developing. The knight comes to c3. It shields the e4 pawn and fixes its eye on d5 at the same time. Black pushes a second pawn forward to c5. Now both of black's wings press inward, leaning on white's pawn at d4. White brings the king's knight to f3. Natural, unhurried, propping up the d4 pawn from behind. Black mirrors the gesture. The other knight comes to c6. It adds its own weight to the push against d4. And now the first capture of the game. White's e4 pawn takes on d5. The tension in the center snaps. A pawn vanishes, and the lines begin to breathe open. Black recaptures with the e6 pawn. He takes d5. Now see what remains standing in the middle. Black has 2 pawns side by side, on c5 and d5, holding the center together. White has a single pawn, alone on d4, facing them both. White develops the light bishop, a modest step to e2. Readying to castle, unhurried, content to wait before committing to anything sharper. Black's king's knight slides to f6. It guards the d5 pawn and reaches toward the squares near white's king. White castles, king and rook glide together on the king side. The king tucks into the corner, wrapped in its own pawns. Black brings the dark bishop to e7. A quiet, dependable square clearing the way along the back rank. Now white's other bishop swings out to g5. It leans on the f6 knight, pinning it lightly against the queen behind it. Black castles too, the king settling into its own corner. Both kings are home now, mirror images, side by side on the king side. Now white decides to resolve the tension. The d4 pawn captures on c5. It takes black's advanced pawn, and for this moment, white is a pawn ahead. But that pawn now sits far away on c5, deep in enemy ground, with no friend to guard it. A prize perhaps, but a hard one to hold. Modern analysis calls this the right choice. The capture is fully sound, and for a moment white is simply a pawn to the good. The trouble is only that the pawn stands stranded in black's half, and winning it back will cost white precious time, the one currency that matters here. Black doesn't reach for it. Instead, the light bishop steps to e6. Developing, defending the d5 pawn, looking quietly across at white's king. Then white's knight leaps from f3 into the middle to d4. And from that central square, it looks two ways at once. At the knight on c6, and at the bishop on e6. Black takes the stray pawn back. The e7 bishop swings down and captures on c5. Material is even again. And that bishop now rakes a long, open diagonal straight toward white's king. This is the soundest recapture. The pawn comes back, the count is level, and the dark bishop wakes on a diagonal pointed at the heart of white's camp. Now white strikes in the center. The knight takes the bishop on e6. On its face, a simple trade, a knight for a bishop. But it does something quieter and more lasting. It breaks black's pawns apart. Black must recapture toward the middle. The f7 pawn takes on e6. It is still seen as the best move on the board. The knight gives itself for the bishop, but in the trade it shatters the wall of pawns sheltering black's king. There was a quieter road, swinging a knight out to the edge and leaving the structure whole. White chose the sharper path instead, and in doing so handed Marshall exactly the kind of open, restless position he loved best. And now look closely at black's pawns. Two of them stacked one above the other on the E and D files, e6 and d5. Doubled, a little isolated, with no neighbor to lend a hand. On a quiet day, a weakness to be nursed for the whole game. But this is not a quiet day, because the f-file has just swung open, right in front of black's king. And a black rook already stands waiting at the foot of it on f8. So here is the bargain black has struck. The pawns are frayed, but in return, the pieces have come alive. The rook breathes up the open f-file. The bishop on c5 glares at the white king. Structure given away for energy. That is the whole story of this position. See it as it stands now, before white's next move. White, a tidy camp on the king side, knight on c3, bishops on e2 and g5. Black, ragged pawns but restless pieces, all of them leaning toward the white king. And now white turns to those tender pawns. The bishop lifts from e2 and settles on g4. From g4 it stares straight down the diagonal at the weak pawn on e6, pressing exactly where black is thinnest. But there is a needle hidden in the move too. The bishop has stepped onto a square the f6 knight is watching. Daring it, asking a question of its own, even as it asks one of the pawn on e6. A modern eye marks this as a small misstep. Chasing the weak pawn is tempting, but it leaves the white knight on c3 loose, with no friend to guard it. The cleaner path was to tuck that knight safely toward the edge first. Instead, a thread is left hanging in the position, and Marshall is exactly the man to find it and pull. The black queen lifts from d8 and comes to rest on d6. From there, she looks along the low diagonal all the way to h2, where white's king is hiding. White answers softly. The light bishop steps back from g4 into the corner, to h3. It tucks itself away, but its eye still rakes across the long pale diagonal toward black's king. Black wakes the last sleeping piece. The rook on a8 slides over to e8. Now both black rooks face the center, patient, one behind the other. White's queen settles down to d2, keeping low, keeping things tied together. And the dark bishop shifts from c5 to b4. A small move with teeth. It pins the white knight on c3 against the queen sitting behind it on d2. That knight cannot move now without losing the lady. The whole position is now strung between a pinned knight and a tied-down queen. Every move white makes from here must keep that fragile knot from slipping, and one slip will be enough. White decides the moment has come, and the dark bishop takes the black knight on f6. Black's rook swings upward to take it back, from f8 up to f6. An odd, lofted perch for a rook, riding high on the 6th rank. Hold that picture. That rook will have a part to play before the end. White's other rook comes to the open file in the middle, from a1 to d1. The black queen glides across to c5. From there she stares at f2, by the white king, and the pinned knight on c3 is still aching. White's queen sidesteps to e2, trying to hold the knot together. And now black pulls at the loose thread. The bishop takes the knight on c3. White must answer with the pawn. b2 takes back on c3. White's pawns on that side are split and stumbling now, a little ruin of doubled men. Then the black queen swoops down and takes the pawn on c3. A pawn is won, and Her Majesty is camped deep in White's half of the board. Modern analysis sees this whole sequence as clean and exact. The bishop is traded for the knight, White's pawns are left split and doubled, and the queen helps herself to one of them. It is the patient, grinding kind of edge that turns a lively game into a winning one. White hits back at once. The rook on d1 snaps off the lone pawn on d5. The count of pieces is roughly level again, but the board has caught fire. Let it grow still in the mind for a moment, just as it stands. White's king on g1 behind its 3 pawns. The queen on e2, a rook on d5, a rook on f1, the bishop on h3. Black's king on g8, the queen deep on c3, a knight on c6, the lofted rook on f6, the other on e8. Now comes the quiet thunderclap. The black knight leaps from c6 into the very middle to d4. It lands like a stone in still water. From d4 it strikes at the white queen on e2, and the pawn on c2, and the tender square f3. And nothing can chase it away. No pawn can reach it. It simply sits in the heart of the board. Modern analysis loves this leap above all else. From the very center, the knight cannot be driven off by any pawn, and it quietly covers the squares on which White's defense would need to stand. It is a move that does nothing loud. and yet leaves white almost no way to breathe. The white queen must run from the knight's reach. The white queen travels all the way to h5. It looks ferocious, the queen swinging toward f7 and h7 by the black king. But this was the slip, the small wrong turning. The better path was a step to e4 into the center. From e4, the queen would guard and threaten in the same breath, and a little of the wind would leave black's sails. Out on h5 she looks grand, but she is 1/2 step away from where the defense truly lived. Black takes the gift of time. A rook drops calmly back from e8 to f8. Now both black rooks are stacked on the f-file, leaning their full weight on f2. White's rook lifts off the center, sliding from d5 to e5, looking for prey. And the lofted rook makes its move at last, from f6 across to h6. It swings toward the h-file now, toward the thin roof over the white king. A colder eye preferred crashing a rook straight into f2 at once. Marshall's choice is slower, but it brings a second wave toward the king. White's queen comes back down to g5, eyeing that rook on h6. Black answers with steal. The rook on h6 crashes down and takes the bishop in the corner on h3. A clean capture, and now a black rook glares straight up the open h-file. It is the strongest move in the position. That bishop in the corner was the one piece guarding the pale squares around the white king. With it gone, the long diagonal and the open h-file become a single road, and it leads straight to the king. White tries one last lunge. The rook swings from e5 over to c5. It attacks the black queen on c3, hoping to shoo her away and steal a breath of time. So let the whole board take its final shape slowly before what comes next. White's king sits on g1, sheltered by pawns on f2, g2 and h2. Just beside it, a white rook on f1, the queen far out on g5, the other rook off on c5. Black's king rests on g8 with its own pawns on g7 and h7 for a roof. A black rook stands on f8, bearing straight down the file at f2. A second black rook sits low on h3, staring all the way up the open h-file. The knight broods on d4, untouchable, watching e2 and f3. And the black queen waits on c3, far from the king she means to hunt. White has just attacked her, fully expecting her to flee. She does not flee. The black queen steps quietly forward to g3. Right in front of the white king, onto a single square where 3 different white men could take her. And not one of them dares. Look first at the plainest reply. White's queen on g5 reaches over and takes her. Then the knight springs from d4 to e2 with check. It forks the king and the queen in one motion. The king must lurch aside, and the knight swallows the queen. Black walks out a whole piece ahead. That door is shut. Now let the f-pawn take her instead. f2 captures on g3. Again the knight jumps to e2, with check. The king has only one bolt hole, the corner, h1. And the rook on f8 comes pouring down the opened file to f1. Mate. The king is sealed in. Its own pawn on h2 blocks the last way out. So the f-pawn cannot take her either. Then surely the h-pawn, h2 simply captures on g3. But the instant that pawn lifts, the h-file is flung wide open. And the black rook waiting on h3 suddenly sees clear up the file to the white king. The knight leaps to e2, check, and this time it is mate where it stands. The king cannot flee to h1 or h2. That rook rules the file. It cannot run to f1. The other rook owns that one. 3 ways to take the queen, and every single one of them loses. And if white just leaves her sitting there, she comes crashing in herself, onto h2, onto g2, and mates the king alone. She rests on g3 like a jewel that no hand can pick up. The story handed down is that the watching masters were so dazzled, they showered the board with gold coins. Whether it happened quite that way, no one can truly say. But the move earned its golden name, and it has never lost it. Marshall lived another 30 years and more, and to the end this was the game his friends asked him to show. He had played in the strongest tournaments of the world, against the greatest names of his time. But it is this single, quiet, unthinkable move that carried his name down the century. There was nothing left for white to attempt. Levitsky let the clock stand and resigned. One queen placed where she could not be touched, and the game was over. The pieces are still where they came to rest, the knight on d4, the rooks on f8 and h3, the queen glowing on g3. Nothing more needs to be played. Let the board stay just as it is, the gold settling over it. And there the game rests, complete. Let the pieces stay where they fell, the squares going quiet beneath them. The board is fading now, the lines softening, the dark folding gently over the edges. No more files to watch, no diagonals to guard. Only the shape of a beautiful game dissolving into the quiet. The image of the board can fade. Nothing left to follow, nowhere left to be. Sleep well. Good night.